Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar entitled Transitioning to the New Healthcare Apprenticeship Standard. We thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of your experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. However, to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panels. Using the tabs of this panel, you can adjust your audio settings, choose to see the webcam of our presenters if available. You can also use the question tab to engage with us. We expect that our webinar will be extremely popular, but our team will do our best to answer any of your questions and queries. During our webinar, we'll be running a number of polls. To record your response, please click on the on-screen voting button when asked to do so. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and a fact sheet to address any unanswered questions. Now, I'd like to hand over to our presenters, Geraldine Donworth and Bill Twigg.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining. This webinar is part of a series of webinars, and this is the first one. We're doing another one on Monday morning, on adult care, and then there's a dental nursing webinar on Tuesday afternoon at 2:30. I just wanted to make sure that everyone was in the right place at the right time. So let's start with an overview of the contents. We're going to have a very quick overview of the apprenticeship reforms. Then we're going to talk in some detail about the healthcare support worker, senior healthcare support worker and assistant practitioner health apprenticeship standards. We'll be talking all the way through really around planning for your delivery and things for you to think about. Then we'll have a look at how we can support you in terms of the endpoint assessment. I'm going to do quite a lot of detail around endpoint assessment, and I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions. We'll then look at some next steps, and then we'll have questions, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some answers. So looking at the overview of the apprenticeship reforms then, this has been going on for a considerable amount of time now, since the Richard Review, in which the aim was to give employers control in designing apprenticeships. The idea was to increase flexibility of delivery, to simplify the funding system, and also increase the effectiveness of training. So they're the aims, which we go through in a lot more detail. There's a link there to a video which has been recorded by my colleague Bill Twigg, who's also in the room, which will give you a lot more detail. It's a really good watch. So we're going to do one of our first polls now.
Okay, so we've got our first poll question. You should see that on screen. So the question is, to what extent does your organisation understand the changes to apprenticeship funding and delivery arrangements? So the answers are low level to little understanding, medium levels, high levels, or need help. Okay. Okay, so it looks like half about high levels and medium level understanding.
That's great. Know who I'm talking to now then. So can we have the next slide? So one of the changes that's taking place, and I'm sure you're very well aware of this, is around the funding of apprenticeships. So we're moving from a situation where we've had SASE or SASE frameworks funded in a particular way, and that's changed since May. In this slide here, we've got detail around the funding bands that are available for the frameworks now, and I've listed those in the table in terms of the level 2 and the various pathways or different qualification pathways and SASE framework pathways that are available for the level 3. There's also information there about the level 5 apprenticeship, with the higher apprenticeship assistant practitioner. I haven't included any of the incentives for that one around 16 to 18-year-old provision, because I don't think it's likely at all that there would be a young person carrying out that particular role. Looking at the future of the standards, we're looking at actually quite a challenging level of funding, I reckon, for the healthcare support worker and the senior healthcare support worker standard. So we're looking at band 4, which is £3,000. I do understand that the funding for the senior healthcare support worker at level 3 is being challenged by the Trailblazer group, which isn't actually meeting as such at the moment, but I do know that the chairs are in touch with Skills for Health. And Skills for Health last week, in fact, were talking about this challenge, and City and Guilds has offered to support the Trailblazer chairs in trying to address that challenge with the ESFA. Also included in this table are incentives around 16 to 18-year-olds for employing apprentices at that age group from the employer perspective and also from the provider perspective. And then we're looking at a maximum possible funding for the provider, which in respect of the level 2 is £4,000, but we have to remember that actually that includes the amount of money that would need to be put aside for endpoint assessment. So let's look at the standards in a little bit more detail and who was involved in the development of those standards. As you can see, there's a wide range of employers, from health trusts, organisations such as Unison and also Skills for Health have been involved in this development, more so I think from a sort of secretariat point of view, but quite a large Trailblazer group. They've worked on developing 4 standards which have been developed and are ready for delivery, which means that the standard itself is published and the assessment plan is also published. These are healthcare support worker at level 2, senior healthcare support worker at level 3. Those 2 are the ones that I'm going to talk about most today. Healthcare assistant practitioner at level 5. And then there's the registered nurse degree apprenticeship, which has also recently been, the assessment plan has recently been published. There's another standard which is in development, which is called the nursing associate apprenticeship, and that's at level 5. That actual new role is being piloted at the moment, and the apprenticeship is being developed alongside that. Those standards are all available on the .gov website, and there'll be a link to the website in the presentation slides that you receive. Let's have a look now at the standard content and explore the endpoint assessment. Before we do that, we'll do a poll.
Okay, so we've got another poll question here. So the question is, which of the standards and options will you be delivering? So we have healthcare support worker, senior healthcare support worker, adult nursing support, maternity support, mental health support. So you should be able to choose more than one if you're offering multiple. There will be another question similar to this to follow with some other options as well. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you on this one are delivering healthcare support worker. Okay, so the same question again. You should see on screen this time with the options of children and young people support, theatre support, allied health profession therapy support, assistant practitioner. Again, you can answer more than one. Okay, in this one it looks like majority are doing assistant practitioner in health.
That is interesting, actually. It's not quite what I expected to see, so that's given me some food for thought, thank you. So let's move on now and start to look at the Healthcare Support Worker Standard in a bit more detail. On the left-hand side of the slide is a summary of the Maths and English requirements and the gateway requirements. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a bit of a pathway, really, in terms of what happens during the apprenticeship. So I think I'll start with the right-hand side and talk you through the programme. Initial assessment has always been part of apprenticeships, really, but I think within the apprenticeship standards, it's really, really important that the apprentice or the potential apprentice has this initial assessment to help them to understand what the apprenticeship journey is going to look like. There are some significant changes, of course, between the framework way of doing things and the standards way of doing things, and that includes the endpoint assessment, which the apprentice needs to be aware of at the beginning of the programme. That allows the apprentice to make decisions actually about whether this pathway is appropriate for them. And it also helps to ensure that apprentices will want to complete the whole apprenticeship as they've understood it from the very beginning. So once the apprentice signs up to their programme, there will be an on-programme element which must be at least 12 months in duration. We've put there that qualifications are not mandatory because in the case of the healthcare support worker that is true, but when we move on to the other standards, actually there is a mandatory qualification. So that's something also that's definitely worth checking out and bearing in mind. The option there with a qualification that's not mandatory is actually if the employer wishes a qualification to be part of the programme, then you can deliver that qualification as part of the on programme. And of course City and Guilds has a current qualification and will have a new qualification which would fill that space. On programme also consists of Maths and English and behaviours also, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So Maths and English requirements are level 1 for the support worker standard, but actually there is a requirement within the assessment plan for healthcare support worker for the apprentice to have attempted a test at level 2, and in fact that is still there in the guidance, in the funding guidance, which also we put a link in with the presentation for that guidance. So the apprentice has to complete the level 1 as a gateway requirement, but must have attempted level 2 Maths and English. There's also a reference in the gateway requirement to the apprentice having various wording actually around the completion of the care certificate. The way I've described it on the slide is that there must be evidence of the apprentice having met the 15 standards as laid out in the care certificate. This is because there is some confusion around the naming of the care certificate, really from the funder's perspective, because it's not a qualification, and obviously many of us understand that. So the requirement is that the apprentice has basically had an induction based on the 15 standards of the care certificate. In this standard, as I said, the qualification specified by the employer could be included, but is not mandatory. And in the last 3 months of the apprenticeship, the apprentice is required to generate a portfolio of evidence, which will then be put forward to their endpoint assessment. Once through the gateway, when the learner, the apprentice, is ready for endpoint assessment, that will consist of a multiple choice test of 60 questions. Ours will be a duration of around 90 minutes. There's a pass, merit and distinction based on the number of correct answers gained. There'll be a practical observation in the workplace, and the evidence from the portfolio will be marked or reviewed by the endpoint assessor, and then there'll be an interview. So it's quite a comprehensive endpoint assessment, this one, and we'll be talking in more detail shortly around that. So once that's been achieved and graded, then there will be completion declared and certification will take place. And then the apprentice is deemed to have reached occupational competence. So if I then take the multiple choice test in a little bit more detail for you, this is outlined in the assessment plan, by the way, and the test, as I said, will contain 60 questions. We're looking at a nice spread, I think, of the gradings from a pass, which is basically 50% of the questions answered correctly, moving through to a merit at 40 correct questions to 49, and then anything over 50 questions out of 60 would be a distinction. So that is really quite clear. Again, in the assessment plan, it outlines what will be tested as far as the multiple choice questions go, and that's looking at the knowledge components of the standard. So we're looking at items like communication, health interventions, personal and people development, health, safety and security, and equality and diversity. And those of us who've been involved in the delivery of apprenticeships and the qualifications before will recognise those as being part of the mandatory group of units within a qualification makeup. So again, no real issues there. The practical observation in the workplace will be a duration of 90 minutes. That will look at skills and behaviours, and again there's quite a detailed outline of what should be covered in that observation within the assessment plan. Moving on to the evidence portfolio and review, there are there is an outline of what the portfolio should contain. It must have evidence of direct observation, and actually, because it contributes to endpoint assessment, this actual element should not have been assessed by an assessor. It could have been reviewed by the employer to ensure that it was of good enough quality, really, to demonstrate the learner's competence against the standard. It should not have been formally assessed. That is then put forward for endpoint assessment, and along with the other elements will form part of the professional discussion or interview with the endpoint assessment. In relation to values and behaviours, interestingly, I think that the values are around the 6 C's, which many of you again will be familiar with, but they're not quite the 6 C's, but we're looking at learners demonstrating that they are caring and compassionate, honest, conscientious and committed. And then behaviours, again, as we'd expect, around treating people with dignity and respect, looking at the individual needs of patients and people who use services, and maintaining things like privacy and dignity. Again, nothing that would not normally be in a qualification, actually, within the healthcare setting. I think I'm done. Okay. So on this next slide, we've got just some examples of some of the knowledge, some of the skills, and again, I've already outlined the values and behaviours. So, you know, that's there for you to read, and that's all in the standard. So I think we can move over that. In terms of senior healthcare support worker standard, let's have a look at that. I'm sure I've changed that maths and English requirement to level 2 previously, but the maths and English requirement is at level 2 within the level 3 standard. Similar gateway requirements in that the 15 standards of the care certificate need to be evidenced. Maths and English there at level 2. And in this standard there is a requirement for a regulated level 3 qualification. For example, at the moment, the City and Guilds Diploma in Health, Clinical Healthcare Support. I'm going to talk a little bit about the new qualification that will be coming on either later this year or early next year. And again, Gateway Preparation is a learning journal in the last 3 months of the apprenticeship, which will be put forward for endpoint assessment. Within the level 3 standard, there are options, and this is one of the reasons why we asked you about options. All maintained in this same standard, but there are slight differences in terms of the content of the on-programme and also the endpoint assessment for each of these options. So we've got their adult nursing support, maternity support, mental health support, children and young people support, which is new, theatre support and allied health profession therapy support. In terms of the endpoint assessment detail, it's a little bit more complicated in that there is a multiple choice and short answer test. Now it's the short answer test that would be slightly different in terms of the endpoint assessment for the different options. And then when we come to the observation of practice, because obviously there will be slightly different requirements and settings, there are slightly different expectations of the apprentice in those particular options. So a mental health setting would be slightly different to adult nursing support. As I said, looking at those qualification requirements, the current qualifications are part of the standard now and are quoted in there as being appropriate. There will be a new level 3 diploma in healthcare support, which is due to be developed and launched in November. However, we are in discussions with Skills for Health at the moment. They are responding to a request from Health Education England about trying to incorporate elements of the bridging programme, that's around study skills, into the level 3 qualifications. So we're working with other awarding organisations on trying to address that need at the moment. The Assistant Practitioner in Healthcare standard, again, the Maths and English requirement is at level 2. The care certificate requirement is still there. There's also a qualification requirement, a regulated level 5 qualification, such as our own diploma in assistant practitioners in healthcare. And then as part of the preparation for endpoint assessment, a reflective journal needs to be completed in the last 3 months of the programme. I haven't been able to go into detail about the endpoint assessment requirements for assistant practitioner. The reason for that is that City and Guilds is not yet on the register of apprenticeship assessment organisations for the level 5 standard, and so I will wait until I do a separate webinar around the level 5 later on in the year. Just wanted to give an outline of the grading, and there's an example here of how each of the elements of the endpoint assessment actually contribute to the overall grade. This example is from senior healthcare support worker, and it's just there to illustrate a point really that each element is actually making a contribution. The observation of practice is only assessed as a pass, but the other elements are there as pass, merit and distinction. So let's have a look at how we can support you to prepare for delivery and the endpoint assessment resources. So this slide here demonstrates a variety of ways in which City and Guilds can support you through your transition. We'll be looking at, and we have actually existing support networks available to you which are health specific. We're carrying out mapping of the existing qualifications to the apprenticeship standards to identify where the standards can be covered and where any potential gaps are. We do have existing qualifications which meet the mandatory requirements of the level 3 and 5 and would meet the requirements of the level 2 standard. We have new qualifications which will be available either, as I said, from November or from January. We're going to produce some endpoint assessment packs for our customers, and I'll go through those in a little bit of detail. We're looking at events to support the development of tutors and assessors on the on-programme element of the apprenticeships in things like carrying out professional discussions so that you can support your apprentices to be prepared for that interview stroke professional discussion which is part of their endpoint assessment. What we don't want to happen, obviously, is that apprentices have no experience of a professional discussion situation and then they're put into this worrying situation where they've never had that experience and you know, don't do their very best. So we'll be helping you to prepare. We've got our existing learning assistant e-portfolio. We're also looking at, well, we've got a wider offer to NHS customers probably than any other awarding organisation, which helps you as organisations, you know, look at a bigger picture in terms of supporting your NHS customers. And then obviously our technical advisors are very well versed in the apprenticeship reforms and the details around each of the standards. And you're involved in one of the webinars today. So looking at some detail around what's going to be in our endpoint assessment pack, we think it's really important that we provide information for you on what your roles and responsibilities are in preparation for the learner, and also what the roles and responsibilities are of others in the process. We want to be able to guide you in terms of the evidence that you'd need for your apprentices to be able to get through the gateway effectively, and also how you'll be able to inform City and Guilds of that. There'll be instruction and guidance on how to book the endpoint assessment with City and Guilds, and also quite a lot of guidance there around what the portfolio, the learning journal and the reflective journal for the level 5 would need to look like, because we don't want to surprise learners, do we, in terms of what the expectation is around their endpoint assessment. In terms of our endpoint assessment pack for our independent endpoint assessors, obviously there will be instructions and guidance on how to review the evidence that's presented to them, with using relevant sections of the standard and the occupational brief for the level 2. Instructions on what a valid practical observation looks like and how to record that, and also what to do if they don't happen to see activities that they need to evidence for that element of the endpoint assessment. We want our endpoint assessments to be assessors to be very experienced and confident in carrying out interviews and professional discussions, and we're looking for people who have the skills in order to put learners at ease through this programme. So there'll be a lot of guidance there and some questions that the endpoint assessors will use, and then of course they'll have their marking and grading criteria. So let's look at an example of a timeline as to when things are going to be available, and I'll go through this for the level 2, and there's a slide there for level 3 which is similar. So we're currently mapping the existing qualifications to the standards, and that mapping will be available as soon as we've completed that. It will be on our website, but we will password protect it, so you'll be able to get that password through the walled garden. We'll be mapping the new qualification as and when we are able to do that. It is almost completed, and we'll be carrying out a webinar for the launch of the new Level 2 diploma in November time. From January, the new qualification will be available, and then from February, the walled garden will open for EPA registrations, and that's when our packs will be issued to our customers. We're also going to provide sample papers for the tests so that learners can have a go. And then from May of next year, our live tests will be available, and that will be the deadline for the first booking. And by August, we're expecting for that first endpoint assessment visit to actually take place. There you can see a similar timeline for the Level 3. Here's the nitty-gritty then. Let's go with our pricing and our offer. So we have on-programme pricing existing for our qualifications. We're setting up endpoint assessment only prices and also a package including the qualification. So our endpoint assessment only for healthcare support worker is £600, and within including the registration costs for the qualification, it would be £670. There's also information there about resit prices. These last slides here just outline the approval process. So if you are a new City and Guilds provider, you'll need to get endpoint assessment financial approval. If you are a current City and Guilds centre, you'll need to apply for EPA approval for the specific occupation, and we'll make the assessment packs, the EPA packs, available once you've registered. Obviously, if you need to deliver a qualification linked to the standard, you need to apply for qualification approval. And in order to do that, you must make sure that your staff have the appropriate occupational expertise. These next two slides, again, are just a flow really of how the programme goes from registration through reservation and booking. At the date is agreed for EPA, the endpoint assessment is carried out. Then we capture data in terms of the results and issue that to the ESFA, and then the results are shared with the provider. And that's that end process. So we're in the process of setting up an application process for people who would be interested in becoming endpoint assessors. We haven't actively recruited yet, though we have had some applications already, expressions of interest. What we want to do is to recruit our independent assessors in a timely way so that we can provide training for them, so and they're still up to date by the time the endpoint assessment is going to be required. We keep an eye on the registrations on standards from the ESFA data that we're able to access, and it's indicating at the moment to us that there are very low levels of registrations onto the standards, but we're keeping an eye on that on a very regular basis, and that will help us to determine when we think we will need endpoint assessors. So look out for that. There is a link to a part of our website where if you wish to become an if you wish to be considered to become an endpoint assessor, then you can express an interest and we will retain your details until such time as we are actively recruiting. And if you'd like to take things further with us, we have an apprenticeship consultancy offer, which looks at understanding your needs and helping you to develop and define solutions in order to be able to implement the change that you need to be involved in order to make these standards available and up and running. We have a plethora of resources which are available on our website. Lots and lots of information there for you, and there are links there to both City and Guilds generated and also government information and documents for you to refer to. And we'd just like to thank you for your attention, and we're keeping our centres up to date in a variety of ways. So if you register for email updates on the City and Guilds website and indicate that you're interested in apprenticeships and then particularly in healthcare, we'll be able to send out those updates to you, and they'll come direct to individuals. And I think we're ready now for questions.
So we have some questions already come through. So if any of you have any questions, please write on the question tab and we'll get them answered for you. So the first question we have here says, when do you hope to be on the register for assistant practitioner standard?
I'll be making the application very soon, actually. And then our situation is that once we've made an application, it's sort of slightly out of our hands. We've got to wait for the ESFA to go through their process, which has been, in our experience, probably between 2 and 3 months.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's Bill Twick here. I think what we would expect is to not be on the register before in 3 months' time. So that would take us towards late this year. But the application is in development and will be submitted shortly.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is in relation to the healthcare support worker level 2. What will happen if they do not see activities listed in the observation, i.e. if moving and positioning people is not part of the learner's role?
Okay. So within the assessment plan itself, there are details of what needs to be covered. However, some of them are actually in bold and some of them are not in bold. So the ones that are not in bold in the assessment plan, and that could be one of them, would be there would be allowances made for gathering evidence perhaps in another way. So it could be that an assessor might ask a question about how would you, rather than observing.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question. It says, can you please take us through the EPA cost slide again?
We'll just bring the slide back up. I mean, don't forget, we will do this certainly, but don't forget you will get this. Yeah, you will get this. So is there any particular element?
No, it just says, can you please just go through the slide again?
Okay.
We can see it on screen, but you will get these slides emailed to you.
So what we've got is, if we just take the healthcare support worker, we'll have 3 ways of basically looking at our programme. So someone might just want to offer a qualification through City and Guilds, so there will be a registration route for a qualification only. We might have also organisations who only want to purchase endpoint assessment from City and Guilds, and perhaps they haven't used a qualification at all in the level 2, or they might have had a qualification used from elsewhere, but they might want to come to City and Guilds for endpoint assessment only. So that's the 3rd column along, EPA only, and that cost would be £600. What we're asking is that there is a registration cost within that of £50. That triggers to us that there's an apprentice who will require endpoint assessment in the near future. And then when a booking is made or a reservation is made, that additional £550, the remainder, will be paid at that point. Then when we're looking at a package, this package allows you to register for the qualification and indicate that you would be requiring endpoint assessment. So there will be an upfront fee of £120, And then the reservation fee, when the learner has been through the gateway and you want to reserve the endpoint assessment, there will be that remaining fee. And you'll notice that is there's a slight incentive to do that. And then we've indicated on the last column what our resit charges will be. That's one of the things that I didn't manage to cover actually, but there are within the assessment plan there is information about how many resits a learner would be allowed to take.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. I'll just take it back to the last slide. Okay, next question. Will centres also be informed what evidence is required to meet standards not met by diploma?
That will be part of the outcome of the mapping document that we're doing. So we'll be able to identify where there are gaps in the existing qualification against the standard. When we come to the new qualifications that are available in January for the level 2, in November or January for the level 3, they should have a tighter fit to the standard, and there will be guidance available which has been agreed across all awarding organisations as to the individual optional units that the learner should be choosing for a particular option in the level 3 standard. So mental health pathway, there will be a list of optional units that would be more appropriate for that learner to complete in order to evidence that pathway.
We have a few minutes left, so if any of you do still have questions, please type them and we'll send you out an FAQ if we don't get to answer them today. We have another question here. Can I clarify that endpoint observation is completed by endpoint assessor?
Yes, that's correct.
Another question, do we have an estimate of when nursing standard will be ready for delivery?
I think I need a bit more information. Is it the registered nurse or the adult nursing support?
If you could retype your question and then we can answer that a bit more accurately.
I'll answer it as if it's the nursing. Okay. So the nursing apprenticeship, that would be the registered nursing apprenticeship, which is a degree apprenticeship, is actually ready for delivery now. It's there, and the government was really pushing for that to be available from September. At the moment, that would be something that City and Guilds wouldn't be involved in because the requirements are for current universities to deliver their nursing degrees, and they are regulated, if you like, in that way through the Nursing and Midwifery Council. If we're talking about the Nursing Associate standard, which is in development, the standard itself, I think, is almost written. It's either almost written or it's there. The assessment plan is being worked on now, but we've got that pilot going on at the moment within trusts with education providers too, in order to work out what the education programme needs to be for a nursing associate.
Okay. Another question. Could you explain what did you mean by saying that assessor's observation on practice should not be officially assessed? Assessor will need observation to support the qualification.
Okay. So in the level 2 standard, there is no mandatory qualification. So part of the gateway is that a learner would need to develop a portfolio of evidence. That must include observation of work practice. That's a requirement. It's in the assessment plan. That cannot be formally assessed because it's got to be assessed as part of endpoint assessment. So it would be the endpoint assessor who was making the assessment judgment on that. It's not to say that the learner couldn't have a review of that evidence with their mentor, their employer, their training provider, but the formal assessment of that is not allowed because it's part of contributing to the endpoint assessment.
Yeah, basically it's a great way to start to look at your that they've reached the gateway, and it's a benchmark that you can use to get a good feeling or get evidence that they would be successful at endpoint assessment. So I think the employers really wanted to give some good guidance about what gives evidence that these people are ready for endpoint assessment. So I think they put in this mechanism to enable a consistent, coherent way for the providers, employers, mentors to check the readiness of the apprentice.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Geraldine. We've come to the end of the webinar. If we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, we will be sending out an FAQ at a later date. So thank you all for tuning in, and please check our website for all further upcoming webinars.